So, when we think about attempting to do the most good in the world, of course, we often have to turn to science and structured inquiry to figure out what actually does accomplish what, right? And it's natural to think that the findings that are out there in the published academic literature are reliable sources of truth, and that to answer important questions, all we need to do is open up that literature and turn to the right page, and there we'll have our answers. Unfortunately, as you're about to hear, and many of you probably already know very well, things are not that simple. There are many problems with the way that current scientific publication happens that hinder our ability to rely on scientific output and make it much less straightforward than one might naively think it would be. So this panel will discuss what the replication crisis is, how the research project of effective altruism should respond to it, and what we can do as a community to help make science better. To moderate, Julia Galef is here. She is the president and co-founder of the Center for Applied Rationality, an organization teaching math and cognitive science-based techniques for effective decision-making. Julia's work has been featured in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Discover, Slate, Fast Company, and Vice. Since 2010, she's been the host of the popular Rationally Speaking podcast. Welcome, Julia. Next up, our first panelist is Stuart Buck. He is the vice president of the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. He leads the foundation's Research Integrity Initiative, which seeks to improve the quality and reliability of scientific research in fields ranging from economics to cancer cell biology. In addition, he helps ensure that research supported by the foundation is as rigorous as possible, and that the foundation's major investments are themselves evaluated by independent experts. He is an attorney and research expert with a background in education policy. He has written and co-written numerous scholarly articles, has testified before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and has been a panelist at many major academic conferences. He is also the author of a Yale University Press book on education in the African American community called Acting White. Stuart holds a PhD in education policy from the University of Arkansas, where he studied econometrics, statistics, and program evaluation. He also has a JD with honors from Harvard Law School, where he was an editor of the Harvard Law Review, and both a bachelor's and a master's in music performance from the University of Georgia. Please welcome Stuart Buck. Brian Nosek is next. He received a PhD from Yale University in 2002 and is a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Virginia. He received early career awards from the International Social Cognition Network and the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. He co-founded Project Implicit, an internet-based multi-university collaboration of research and education about thoughts and feelings that exist outside of our awareness or control. He also co-founded and directs the Center for Open Science, which aims to increase openness, integrity, and reproducibility of scientific research. It's a nonprofit technology startup with three primary activities. One, building and maintaining the open science framework, which supports research workflow and enables transparency, archiving, and pre-registration of plans for studies. Two, building community and shifting incentives such as badges for articles to acknowledge open practices. And three, conducting meta-science, such as estimating the reproducibility of scientific research by conducting large-scale, crowdsourced replication projects. Please welcome Brian Nosek. Ivan Oransky is next. He is the vice president and global editorial director of MedPage Today, co-founder of the MacArthur Foundation and Arnold Foundation funded Retraction Watch, and distinguished writer in residence at New York University's Arthur Carter Journalism Institute. He previously was executive director of Reuters Health and held editorial positions at Scientific American and The Scientist. He is the recipient of the 2015 John P. McGovern Award for Excellence in Biomedical Communication from the American Writers Association. He has written for numerous publications, including Nature, The New Republic, and The New York Times. He is also a clinical assistant professor of medicine at NYU's School of Medicine and serves on the board of directors and as a vice president of the Association of Healthcare Journalists. Please welcome Ivan Oransky. And finally, Stephanie Whitestraw is here. She is a research consultant for All Trials, a nonprofit focused on improving transparency in clinical trials reporting, and also a freelance writer. She previously directed the Research Transparency Initiative at Innovations for Poverty Action, where she managed their data repository and conducted training workshops on reproducible research. Stephanie has also held research positions with philanthropic advisory groups, including GiveWell, and worked in academia as an assistant professor of philosophy. She has a BA from Yale University and earned a PhD in philosophy from Rutgers University, where she specialized in epistemology. Please welcome Stephanie Whitestraw. Julia, take it away.
Thank you, Nathan. So I'm going to give a little bit of context for this panel, and then I'll let each of my panelists tell you a little bit more about how they've been involved in this topic before we jump into questions. So I think many EAs have had a kind of growing concern about what's been termed the replication crisis, unless, of course, they were already familiar with how bad things were, then maybe their concern wasn't growing. In a nutshell, the replication crisis is the fact that a significant fraction of studies across different fields in science and social science are failing to replicate, meaning that when a new group of researchers looks for that original effect in a new sample with very similar methodology, they fail to find it, casting into doubt whether the original effect was in fact real. This has mostly so far been discussed in psychology, maybe a little in neuroscience or biology, but just a couple of weeks ago, one of the central studies to effective altruism, which was a study showing the effectiveness of deworming as a poverty reduction intervention, was cast into doubt by a replication that arguably failed to find the effect. That's still very controversial. The so-called worm wars are ongoing, and that is kind of the backdrop against which we're having this panel. So the questions I'm hoping to address today are, first, how big and bad is the replication crisis? In particular, in the areas that are most relevant to effective altruism. Second, what solutions have been tried or do our panelists think should be tried? And then third, a lot of people, when discussing this crisis, will say, science is self-correcting in the long run. In fact, the fact that we're having this discussion about the problems with replication is a good sign. And to a large extent, I agree. But as the saying goes, in the long run, we're all dead. My point being that in the meantime, we as effective altruists need to make decisions about where to spend our time and money. And so I'm hoping that we can also talk about heuristics for evaluating or interpreting research against this backdrop of flaws in the scientific method. So with that introduction, I'd like each of my panelists to just give a brief introduction to how they've been involved with the replication crisis, how they've studied it, or maybe tried to improve it. Brian, do you want to start?
Sure. I have a research lab at the University of Virginia where we study the gap between values and practices, what we think we should do, what we're trying to do, versus what we actually do in our everyday behavior. And we started the Center for Open Science as a practical application of that interest on the gap between scientific values, transparency, reproducibility, self-skepticism, versus the actual practices of everyday science. And how can we bridge that gap between what we're trying to do in science versus what actually happens in scientific practices? And the approach that we have is to try to address multiple aspects that contribute to the barriers in living according to our scientific values. One being that we don't have the tools, the infrastructure available to be transparent with our entire research process. And so we're building tools to enable people to be more transparent and reproducible in their research. Second is that people may have the desire to do it, but not have the training for how they can be reproducible in their practices. So we offer training services for improving reproducibility and how to use these tools. And then third, they may have the desire to do it, but realize that they're not going to be successful in their everyday work if they practice openly, because really it's all about getting published. And so we are nudging the incentives for scientists so that being open and reproducible in their work is aligned with career success. And so that's really the bulk of the kinds of things that we are doing, in addition to the meta-science work of just trying to see if there are challenges in reproducibility in the first place.
Great. Stuart?
Sure. So I've been at the Arnold Foundation, the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, for about 4.5 years. And initially was just focused on research and evaluation, but very early on, about 4 years ago, we started noticing the replication problems, first in psychology, and the kind of growing discussion there even 4 years ago. And as a foundation that's very concerned about evidence and data, evidence-based policy, it's something that we pursue in all the kinds of arenas that we get involved, from education to criminal justice. It was a growing matter of concern to us that a lot of the published evidence that we look to and that we think might be reliable might actually not be reliable, and or maybe it is, but we just can't tell. I mean, who knows? Like, there's publication bias, there's incentives that Brian mentioned. There are problems with the way people analyze and collect data. There's occasionally outright fraud, although I think that's a minority of the instances of concern. But so we started worrying that if the evidence is unclear, then how can we be guided by evidence? And I think that's a fundamental concern to effective altruists as well. If you want to be effective, then you need to have evidence for being effective, and then you need to question whether that evidence is actually true and actually representative of the actual processes that affect human nature and our society and so forth. So we launched an area of investment in research integrity, is what we call it, but trying to promote the improvements to the scientific process to try to make science more reproducible, more transparent. That included funding the Center for Open Science with Ryan and some of the others on stage as well. So it's all in service of trying to promote the greater good by building the basis of evidence upon which we can take further action.
Great. Ivan.
So Adam Marcus and I founded Retraction Watch 6 years ago. We actually celebrated our 6th anniversary this week. Thank you. Here's to that. I don't know what the 6th anniversary gift is. I should probably look that up. My wife and I passed that a number of years ago. Adam had been reporting on retractions for some time. He and I are both journalists. That's what we do in our day jobs. Retraction Watch is technically a side project, remains one. But he had uncovered some really impressive stories. One in particular in anesthesiology, where someone had actually gone to jail, had gone to prison for scientific fraud. Very rare situation. It's only happened 3 times in the last decade. And because we're journalists, because we saw a real lack of transparency in the retraction notices themselves. So just to back up, a retraction, as I'm sure you all know, but it's sort of the nuclear option, if you will, in scientific self-correction. And science, and I think rightfully so in the aggregate and maybe from 30,000 feet, prides itself on self-correction, perhaps more than any other field. I don't want to sort of criticize my fellow journalists, but we're not really probably as good as we could be at doing that, and certainly that's true of other areas. So we just thought this would be a great way to talk about transparency, to really expose some of these great stories, which as journalists, that's like catnip for us, when you know that there's something behind that public notice and it turns out to be fraud or misconduct or something like that. What we didn't know, and we could claim to have known this because we're such smart guys, but we didn't, was that we're actually in the midst of a retraction boom. So there were about 40 retractions in 2000 and about 400 retractions in 2010, the year we launched. That number's increased, and I can talk about why if that's of interest. It does still, and I think this gets to Stuart's point, this still represents a vanishingly small percentage of the papers published. I mean, you're talking about now 700 papers retracted every year, about 1.4 million or even 2 million published every year, depending on which database you're looking at. But we're very interested in this process of self-correction. We sort of burrow into that. We find these stories, often breaking the stories, sometimes before a paper's retracted. And a couple years ago, we had the opportunity, thanks to some very generous funding from MacArthur and from Arnold as well, and later from the Helmsley Trust, to expand our offerings and to build a database of retractions. Because one of the most problematic areas, we think, is that more than 90% of the time, when a retracted paper is cited, it's cited as if it had never been retracted. So just think about that. People are citing a retracted study in support of doing the next step. That's really deeply problematic. So what we're doing, working with Brian and his team at the Center for Open Science, is building a database of retractions so that hopefully shouldn't happen. It's okay to cite it, but you really should know what it's doing. We've expanded our efforts in some other ways too, and I'm happy to talk about those as well.
Great. Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Whitestraw, and I currently am a consultant for All Trials, which is a group working on clinical trial transparency. But previously, I worked for Innovations for Poverty Action, which is a nonprofit that conducts randomized control trials in developing countries, primarily working with development economists. And my role there was, when I joined in 2014, was to set up IPA's Research Transparency Initiative, developing a policy for open data sharing and figuring out where to share the data and how to check the data in code, basically how to approach transparency at an organization that's conducted 500 ongoing and completed randomized control trials. So I got interested in this area of open science through my work with GiveWell a few years ago. And I was working with GiveWell on meta-research. So how do we improve research? What are the problems with research? And I still remember, I think in 2010, when publication bias kind of hit me like a ton of bricks, realized, this is a huge problem. The skew to positive results in the published literature is a big reason to doubt the literature and to worry about that. And so I spent the last few years working on open science initiatives.
I can confirm that Stephanie is one of the most skeptical of all of my friends, and that whenever anything is reported, the first thing our friends will say is, we should ask Stephanie what she thinks. She's going to be skeptical. So the first thing I want to address is this phrase, replication crisis, because I think the word crisis implies that things have gotten unusually bad in recent years. And I'm wondering if that is in fact your impression, or whether instead things have always been just this bad, or maybe even worse before, and it's only just now that we're starting to talk about the problem or investigate the problem and realize that it is a problem. What do you think?
I can answer first, I guess. We don't know. There are good reasons to think both. The reason to think that it's getting worse is that the incentives for success, I need to publish as frequently as possible in the most prestigious outlets that I can in order to be successful. Those incentives are becoming more pressured over time because the environment is more competitive. There are more people for just as many or fewer jobs. And so that would intensify all of the practices that might lead to a crisis. On the flip side, those incentives have been around for a long time. And so it's not at all clear that we're just now getting better at detecting rather than it being something that's larger. Other qualifications?
Go ahead.
I would just say, I would more basically agree with Brian that in terms of what we look at, and again, reproducibility is a much bigger issue, much, like orders of magnitude bigger than fraud and misconduct and retractions. I mean, those are actually almost two separate things, even though one is sort of a small part of the other. We're fairly sure, and again, I'll be careful here because I don't think there's necessarily evidence in the way that we would all in this room want to think about it, but we're fairly sure that the reason the number of retractions has gone up so much, and I think there's a parallel in terms of reproducibility and realizing there are issues in the literature, is basically a screening effect. When you start to look for a particular disease, condition, or problem, or solution for that matter, you're going to see a lot of it where it might have seemed as though it didn't exist before. So papers all going online, which is a terrific thing. The fact that so many more open access, the fact that you don't have to go to a dusty library stacks to find two different papers to compare them to see if they're actually the same. That's all a good thing, but it also means you're going to uncover things. So it's sort of hard to say.
I guess I would say kind of distinguishing two kinds of reproducibility or replications. We have on the one hand reproducing studies, collecting new data, and that's something that, for example, Brian has focused on a lot with the reproducibility project in psychology. And on the other hand, sharing data and code so as to enable others to replicate or reanalyze the published results. And as far as the latter and that kind of replication, I think the movement towards transparency has been picking up steam, and we've seen a number of journals adopting policies. And I know there have been studies over the years, for example, looking at the American Economic Review and their data sharing policy. That's actually when that was put in place, and then when they actually enforced it and required publications, data and code to be shared along with publications, I think that has improved the kind of reproducibility that means checking that the data and code can reproduce the published findings. Now, of course, it's far from perfect, and we can look at studies showing failure to reproduce in that sense, but transparency does help with that kind of reproducibility.
So that gets to another question about what it means when a paper fails to replicate, because one argument that the replication crisis isn't actually as bad as it seems is that if you reproduce with new data, or if you try to reproduce a result with new data and you fail to, it doesn't necessarily mean that the original effect isn't real. It could just mean, well, inevitably this new study is in a slightly different context. Maybe you're looking at a different demographic of subject, for example. So if you don't find an effect, maybe that just means the effect is more local, more limited than we had previously thought, but not necessarily false. To what extent does that seem like the right interpretation to you all?
Me again? Okay.
Oh,
no,
sorry.
no,
You should all feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I'm happy to start again. Why don't you start?
I think my head wants to rest this way, but
Everybody looks at me.
Yeah, well, I mean, you were just involved with the reproducibility project in psychology, and so speaking for Brian, so he concluded his paper in science, co-authored paper in Science, basically saying that we don't know for sure what the right answer is. Here are some studies. We tried to replicate them. Some replicated, some didn't. The ones that didn't, we can't claim to know that the original study was necessarily wrong or that the new replication is right. It just adds to the body of evidence because for the reasons that Julia set forth, there are innumerable ways in which trying to replicate a study in a new context with different experimental subjects, there may be all sorts of variation that you're introducing into that. But I think the conclusion we should draw from that is, number one, that we need better disclosure of methods and details in the original papers to begin with. And we need a little more kind of epistemic modesty as to any one paper that comes out. Like, no one paper that comes out should be the subject of a TED Talk on why this is the truth about human nature, because it probably isn't. The truth is probably more nuanced than any one paper can capture, and it does, I have to say, seem a little convenient sometimes when the authors of original papers, they turn out to fail to replicate, all of a sudden think of 1,000 reasons why their original study, of course, would have only worked in Florida. Or that kind of thing. We would like to have heard that explanation when you first published rather than after it failed to replicate.
I think the power posing result that failed to replicate recently, one of the explanations, I believe, was, well, in our study we had them hold the pose for 2 minutes and you had them hold the pose for 4 minutes. So of course, what would you expect?
Right.
Wouldn't replicate.
Yeah, exactly.
Any other thoughts on how to interpret replications? I can move on. Okay, I'll move on. So the fields, as we've been talking about how psychology is sort of at the center of the replication crisis, and I'd like to talk a little bit about how much we should expect the scale of the problem to be similar, or the type of the problem to be similar, in the fields most relevant to effective altruism, which off the top of my head seem to be economics, especially economic development, but also public health and epidemiology. Do you happen to know, or do you have any guesses as to what the state of reproducibility is in those fields?
So, and Brian would be more up on the psychology figures, obviously, than I would, but if you look at other fields, one of the signals, it was interesting, and we're really outsiders, we're journalists, so we're looking at every field, or whatever fields sort of come across our radar. And psychology, I think, is the one that captured the public attention, but the one that captured the sort of scientific community's attention, or at least this particular scientific community, was in cancer research. So the very first kind of signal of this was a paper that came out, and somewhat ironically, I think, was not really peer-reviewed at the highest level, and also never made their data set available, which we can all sort of chuckle at. Well, maybe we shouldn't chuckle at it, given the subject. So 90% of basic cancer research studies, not clinical trials, but basic cancer research studies that Amgen tried to replicate actually just wouldn't reproduce. They wouldn't replicate. That number is probably a bit high. There was something about that data set. But if you look consistently in the life sciences, it's something between 50 and 60% and this is preclinical science, which isn't, again, clinical trials isn't really epidemiology, but is looking at, how does something work? How does this drug work in the lab? Maybe how does it work in animal studies, for example? And so that's probably pretty consistent. In economics, there have been a couple of replication sort of analyses, if you will, and one of them showed 40% replication rate. The other one showed, I think, a 60% replication rate. So and those are all disparate data points, and there's lots of reasons for various things. But we do sort of seem to be centering and sort of settling out, if you will, around 50% of studies not being reproducible, can't be replicated in various fields. Other fields haven't really looked at it yet.
And the main challenge is clear, which is every field can improve. Reproducibility is a challenge across the sciences, not limited to the social behavioral sciences either, all the way across to the physical sciences, in part because of what's rewarded in practice, also because of lack of full explanation of what the methodologies are, and it being difficult even to understand what was done, even by the original researchers, of what's relevant for those effects. And so the percentages will vary as more evidence is collected, but that sort of basic finding is affirmed at each step of the process. We're doing an open version of the Cancer Biology Replication Project now, so that there will be data available so that people can scrutinize that. But this is a pervasive challenge.
Does anyone have a sense of, if you had to break down the causes of the lack of reproducibility, how much of them would be the incentive problem that Brian's been talking about versus a knowledge problem? Like, statistics is hard. A lot of social scientists aren't familiar with the specifics of how to adjust your p-values given the number of regressions you try to run, et cetera, et cetera. So incentives versus knowledge is one way you could break down causes. You could also break it down in terms of how much of the problem is within a study, did the researchers use good methods, versus in journals, how does the process by which they decide what to publish affect the conclusions that end up becoming consensus? So how would you break down the causes of the problem?
So just to jump in, not quite to answer your question yet, I think it is important to make the clear distinction, and I don't want to be pedantic about it, but between running new studies and reproducing in that sense, and then we could talk about the causes there, and this other sense of what Michael Clemens, who's an economist who wrote a paper on kinds of replication last year, I think he calls this duplication or reanalysis. So duplication being you get the data in code, underline someone's paper, try to reproduce, sorry, I don't want to use reproduce there, try to redo their analysis exactly, or reanalysis where you might go further to change some of the assumptions, to include or exclude some of the outliers, and to change the analysis in that way and continue to look at whether the findings hold up under those robustness checks. And so what I'm more familiar with and what I can speak to more is the kind of replication that includes getting the data in code and doing the duplication and reanalysis. And so there has been some work looking at rate of the ability to duplicate and reanalyze. For example, Chang and Lee wrote a paper last year looking at 67 papers in 13 top economics journals, and they found they could replicate about 50%, meaning that they could duplicate the analysis. So the causes there, I could speak to having worked with IPA researchers on helping them share their data in code. I think it's important to think about transparency throughout the research lifecycle in order to be able to share the data in code well later on. And so some of the problems in trying to replicate using the original data in code include just missing code, code that doesn't run, variables that don't include metadata like labels and names, so you can't really tell what they are, or just failure to share the data in code entirely. And so I think those kinds of causes and that kind of failure to reproduce is very different from what we might say about the attempt to redo studies. So, and I won't speak to that, I'll let others talk about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. There's really layers of reproducibility, one being just what the result is that the original group reported. Can, even with the same data, you get the same evidence? A second layer is take the same data and ask the same question of it, but make your own choices in the analysis process. We did a project where we gave 29 different teams the same data set and the hypothesis to test, and they all came up with different answers with the same data set. I mean, this just shows there's so many choices that go into how to analyze data, that we don't recognize how much impact they have for the results. A third layer is then redoing it, trying to do the exact same thing to the extent possible that the previous group had done. Do you obtain the same results? And the third, which was another point that or the fourth, is another point you were making, is do you get the same finding, right? You test in a new way in order to try to get rid of confounds, in order to try to see if you can validate it with other measures, and then do you affirm the result in terms of the interpretation, even if you're using different methodology. All of those are areas for information loss or error or lack of reproducibility, and there's problems at every level. And it all comes down to, we can sort of say, which ones are contributing. All of the things you mentioned are contributing, but the answer is the same for all of them, which is transparency. If you can see the process by which I got to my result and have access to the content, the data, the materials, the code that helped me arrive at that result, then you can critique what I did. If you don't see that part of the process, there is no way for you to take the paper at the end and understand what might have led to lack of reproducibility at the end.
As far as the causes, I think it's a little bit of all of the above, but I think one cause is just something that's deeply embedded in human nature that I suspect has long and deep roots in our history as a species, is that we love a good story. We all love a good story. Stories are more interesting to us than data, just by nature. I mean, I think that applies to all of us, most of us, whether or not we want to necessarily admit it. But so we tell stories to each other about great heroic scientists who made great discoveries, or even inventors like Thomas Edison. The story that may or may not be apocryphal, I don't know. It doesn't matter because it gets repeated, and that's the point. That he tried 1,000 different ways to make a light bulb and then finally discovered the one that worked. Well, no one tells stories about some obscure would-be inventor who tried 1,000 ways to do something and never found anything and then quit, right? We tell stories about the person who had the success at the end of a long string of failures. And so we all like that too of our science. We love the story when we read about it of someone who was investigating different genes and then found one that is connected to a particular type of cancer and that presents the potential that maybe we'll come up with a drug to target that gene. Like, we love that story. We don't love the story about someone who went through 19,999 other genes and found that none of them were connected to cancer, and that's just all there was to it. Everything failed. Like, we love the good story with the positive result that presents some sort of inspiration or some sort of hope for the future. But for that very reason, which is, again, deeply understandable and embedded in our nature, we're biased towards positive results. We're biased, journals do this, funders do this, scientists on an individual level do this, university committees do this. They love it when there's a good story to be told about a particular research finding. And so that, in many conscious and probably mostly unconscious ways, can bias the ways in which scientists conduct their research, because they're genuinely eager to come up with a solution to poverty, or a solution to cancer, or a solution to whatever it is that they're studying. And so, given the hundreds or thousands of choices that they can make along the way in doing research and collecting data and choosing how to clean and analyze it, what statistical models to use, and variables to include or to transform. I mean, there's so many choices that go into analyzing data. And if you're hoping, even unconsciously, to find something interesting to tell that also happens to maximize your chances of publication and your career prospects, that you're going to be led down a path that ends up biasing the results, even despite your best intentions. And so I think that's what we're kind of all grappling with here.
So it sounds like the incentives, there are many ways in which incentives are contributing to the problem. Is there any way to give people, to set up the system so that people have an incentive to do the boring work of trying to duplicate or reproduce results, or to incentivize the journals to publish uninteresting, negative results, and so on? Or I'm just trying to think of what kind of, this feels like a coordination problem to me, because the researchers who are doing the boring research are going to be at a disadvantage relative to the ones who are doing exciting research, and same for journals, right?
They don't have to be, actually. I think we've all said in different ways there are 100 different sort of contributors to this problem. And maybe that's underestimating how many contributors there are. And each of them is going to require a slightly different solution. Incentives, to me, though, are really they're at the top of the list. And so how do you get researchers to, A, do the work that may be considered boring, replicating somebody else's work? Nobody gets a PhD for that. Nobody gets a paper in Nature or Science or New England Journal of Medicine for that, at least not now. How do you get people to do that and then choose to publish it instead of contributing to what I think sort of Stuart was alluding to, which is this file drawer problem, right? I have this result that either it just, it replicated, or it confirmed something we already knew, or it just didn't seem to do anything. It was basically a null result, or I'll just put it in the file drawer, the electronic file drawer. And so one thing that we think Adam and I sort of are very excited about is that if you think about funding that work, instead of funding the next big thing that someone claims could be a cure or a treatment for this or a solution to poverty, that could be really interesting. So the Netherlands is actually doing that. And it's not a lot of money right now, but it's a pilot project with 3 million euros where they're saying, hey, we will only fund replication, reproducibility studies, confirmatory studies, or studies that disprove something, a previous result. And so the point is, that's a little bit of an intro, and again, it's a pilot, but if other groups do that, there's this 21st Century Cures Act that seems to basically be living forever in committee on the Hill, and if they're going to give $9 billion more to the NIH, well, maybe some part of that could be earmarked for reproducibility studies. That'd be pretty interesting, because once you do that, because what do universities really, like the one we're sitting in, what do they really need? They need, researchers to bring in funding. And if you can do that by doing these quote-unquote, boring studies, you're as valuable as the person who's scrabbling for the study to have the next cure.
It very much is a coordination problem, and funders play a big role in the things they choose to fund as part of it. Universities can play a role by shifting their hiring and promotion policies. I went up for full professor year before last, and the committee had me send all of my articles in print to them. They weren't going to read 100 articles. They could have said, send us 3, and we're going to read them, right? And that would have, if I'd known that in advance, it would have changed my orientation to, what do I need to produce? I need to produce 3 fabulous articles that have evidence that people would buy, rather than I need to produce just as much as I can and just keep churning it out. And then researchers and journals and publishers all have a big role to play themselves in very simple changes in the incentives. You don't have to reinvent the system. You just have to nudge it a bit. For example, we have one incentive intervention where we got a journal to offer badges for open practices. Just a little badge on the article if the researchers fulfilled the criteria for open data or open materials or pre-registration. And you might say, badges? What? We don't need no stinking badges. What are badges going to do for us? They're not going to do anything. But badges are signals, right? This is Psychology 101. Badges signal behaviors that we can tell at a distance that other people might value. And if they do value it, then I can show that I'm doing that thing. So the journal that adopted it, before adoption, had 3% of the articles with open data for the 2 years prior to adoption of badges. In the 6 months, a year after adoption of badges, 39% of the articles had open data, right? So a badge created a 13-fold increase in the rate of open data sharing. Why? Not just because it was a badge, but because it's a value that already exists in the community. So all you need to do is give people an opportunity to show that they're behaving according to the values that already exist. This is a much easier change than seatbelts. Interesting. Right? Because the values are there. And you don't need to convince people, persuade people that they need to do this new thing. All you need to do is give them an opportunity to express it. And if you do it in an efficient way, then they will do it. And they'll be rewarded for it.
Feels like a rare piece of good news in this whole process. Something you said just a minute ago about, if I knew that I was only going to be judged on the quality of a limited number of papers, then that would change the way I would do my research. I often like to fantasize that I'm the grand empress of research funding, and I get to decide, I can wave a magic wand and reallocate how funding is being divided up among different kinds of studies. Yes, this is the kind of thing I fantasize about. And so in my fantasy, the way I would do it is I would take the total amount of funding we're currently spending, not necessarily increasing it, and just spend it on a much smaller number of studies, like orders of magnitude fewer, but make them really good studies, the kind where we can update on the results from just that one study. So they would be long-term, following effects years into the future. They would be randomized. They would have control groups. They would be studies in the domain that we actually care about instead of a sort of contrived proxy domain in a lab. And some effects we were curious about, we maybe couldn't run this kind of study on, which, okay, fine, we'll spend our money on other topics that we can run this kind of gold standard study on. I know other people disagree with this view and think that having more, like a large number of mediocre studies actually does give us more total insight than a small number of very high quality studies. But I'm curious, if you were Empress or Emperor of research funding, how you would allocate the funds.
Well, I guess just a couple of comments, and I don't think I can answer your full question and give the complete answer, but just a worry and then a comment. So one worry about having just a few really high-quality gold standard, pre-analysis plans submitted, all the bells and whistles you want for high quality, is that at least in development economics, one major concern is that if you have just a few and they're in one local place with one population, the external validity concern. Will those results travel? Will they apply? Even if you find significant results, how well will they hold up in another domain? And I don't think that's an answer, but I'll just comment about that worry. And then another thought is, I think one thing that it is important to think about in allocating funding, there's the content of the studies you fund, but there's also funding the transparency component. So especially in sharing not just a very small subset of the data underlying one publication, but in sharing hundreds of variables, all the collected data. And if funders start to require that, I think, as they are, I think that funding, support funding for data curation, for data sharing is important as well, because that can be quite time-consuming to prepare and to curate and to make it usable to others when it's placed in a data repository. So that's just a thought on how some funding could be spent.
Yeah, I guess one of my concerns would be, I think, parallel to what Stephanie was saying, which is that already, at least, again, I'm looking mostly at the life sciences, NIH funding in particular, and the analogs in different other countries. Already, it is what a number of people have described as a winner-takes-all kind of approach. Sure, there are lots of people being funded, but you're talking about massive, say, genomics projects getting $50 million, which it doesn't sound like a lot out of $32 billion or whatever the NIH budget is. But when you start to sort of think about these major projects, so I would just put a little concern on that. But I think it sort of does get back to funding a lot of the work that it takes to be reproducible, or the work that it takes to be transparent and open. You may have all heard about this sort of much criticized comment that the editors of the New England Journal of Medicine made in February, calling anyone who, they didn't call it, this is a little complicated, but they were sort of quoting others saying that anyone who takes someone else's data set and tries to reanalyze it or do a lot of the work that we've been talking about here, they're what's called as what's referred to as a, quote, research parasite. That was sort of deeply problematic, to say the least, to me and to Adam, and a lot of other people have thought about this. And so, to me, we need to actually fund that work. And then, so maybe that's the big project, right? So maybe that's the way to sort of focus our energies, rather than necessarily sort of just let's do these 3 studies.
I mean, I agree, that's a somewhat toxic attitude, but it does get to the real concern that, a barrier to totally open science and sharing data with the public is you presumably went to a large expense to collect that data. And if everyone else gets to benefit from it once you've collected it, then that kind of reduces incentives to collect new data, right?
It can, but there's also solutions to that, which is you get credit for others' uses. But on your earlier point, I think to the extent that a fewer number of studies means higher powered studies, I'm totally on board. because low-powered studies are not diagnostic of anything. They're greater false positives and false negatives from low-powered research. So there's actually a strong ethical problem in doing low-powered research, especially when you're either sacrificing animals to do it or they're patients or human participants that have some cost for being in the research.
Right.
Why would we fund low-powered research and use them in that way for that purpose? A shift in funding strategies that funders could do might actually be the opposite, not to fund low-powered research, but fund micro grants. We have a pilot project with 30 journals for this concept called registered reports. So the basic idea of registered reports is that the researchers submit to the journal research question and the methodology they're going to use to test that question before they've done the data collection. Right. And so the journal gives an in-principle acceptance, or not, of that plan and says we will publish it regardless of outcome. So this combats the publication bias and bias against negative results, and it's easy to join with funders' review process. It's the same review process. This is what funders supposedly are doing, is funding before they know what their outcomes of research are. So if you join those process where the single submission, the funder funds it, the journal guarantees to publish it, they're partners in the process, everybody wins, right? For funders, they get a lot greater return on investment. The things that they fund will get published, and so often research doesn't go anywhere, right? Costs everybody. For the journal, they're delighted to have the research that they're going to publish be funded research, right? It's powerful research. And for the researcher, they say, I only have to go through this once, and I haven't even done the research yet, and I get funded, and I get it published, fantastic, right? So it is perfect for everyone, and you can fund in increments, right? People do exploratory discovery work. They get to what that finding is going to be. They submit that for both funding and for peer review, and that study gets funded. And so you could fund a lot more people at a lot smaller scale with such a model.
I want to read the small print.
There is no small
Sounds too
print.
good
That's
to
it.
be true.
You know the whole thing. That's it.
Yeah, the small print, I would say, has other advantages that you often talk about, but that peer review becomes focused on the quality of your data collection and your planned statistical methods, as it should be, rather than did you try enough things to get the p-value under 0.05, which is, sometimes happens in peer review, and you're actively making articles worse when that's the kind of process.
Right. Or is this consistent or inconsistent with my theoretical orientation? And if it's inconsistent, I think I should reject this article. Right. If it's consistent, I think, oh, this is the best study I've ever seen.
Right.
Yeah.
A somewhat related solution I've heard floated is results blind peer review, where a journal will decide whether to accept or reject just based on reading about your methodology before they know how the study turned out. Is that something that has traction, or is that just an idea at this point?
There are some journals in the management literature that are trying it, and it is a good step. The main limitation is that most of the reason for negative results not getting the literature is because of researchers themselves deciding not to try to publish it, not because the journals reject it.
Would that still be true even if they knew that it was results blind?
That possibly would change. We don't know yet. So it's a good hypothesis, right? That I could say, well, I'm just going to write it up anyway. But usually we don't do studies on things where we think we're going to get a negative result. So a negative result in the lab is a failure. I was looking for this result. I wanted to find this thing. I didn't get it. Let's put that aside. I screwed up.
Probably also researchers will know that a negative result, even if it gets published, is not going to be cited as much. Maybe they don't want to spend their time.
Right.
And the journals, researchers and journals end up having the same incentive when it comes to citations, right? So the impact factor, which we could spend a whole other week talking about, most studies, it's positive studies that get cited, and therefore that helps the impact factor of journals. That's how they're judged. Some of them even use that in marketing materials. And until we sort of break that somehow, negatives. And again, I think the nice thing here is that there are 100 different things to try, and then we, of course, have to subject them to RCTs, to randomized controlled clinical trials, just to get even more meta. But, no one solution's obviously going to.
So here's what we want to try for that journals problem, because I think you're right on target with that, right? So right now, researchers are evaluated on outcomes. Get novel, you just said this, novel, positive, clean outcomes versus negative outcomes. Journals are evaluated the same way because of an impact factor, right, on outcomes. So we want to create a scorecard on journals' process. Journals that do things to promote transparency, that demonstrate reproducibility in the research that they publish, why don't we give that a score? and then they can use that as an alternative metric for the value of the journal that's not citation dependent. And if we can get traction on such a metric, then journals would strive for being the best process of evaluating and publishing research rather than getting the best outcomes.
So we're incentivizing the right thing.
That's the idea, yeah.
I have another idea, which might sound crazy, but sometimes I just like to think about how would we brute force this problem? Like, if we could just throw money at the problem, how could we solve it? What if we just bought the journals? Like, if a super wealthy philanthropist who cared about improving science wanted to, focus on that, could they just buy Science and Nature and then decide they're going to force everyone to pre-register and share data, et cetera, et cetera?
I mean, the answer to that is probably, but we actually have some real-life examples of things that are similar to that. So the Wellcome Trust just launched something called Wellcome Open Research, where anyone that they fund, and Wellcome's a huge funder, I'm sure many of you are from the UK, you're well aware of that. So you can publish actually what's known as a preprint, so before it's in peer review, and then it goes through peer review openly, okay? And then if it's accepted, if it's approved by a couple of peer reviewers, it actually gets listed in all the indices and all that and gets promulgated. eLife is another journal that, I'm going to forget everybody, but there were three. It was Wellcome, it was Howard Hughes, and
Max Planck.
Max Planck, thank you, Brian, that basically took it upon themselves to create a journal, which is open access, which actually doesn't cost anything to publish in, which is another obviously problem for some researchers. So they're sort of doing that without sort of just buying the old ones. I mean, it's I think sort of the same idea.
Although the old ones have prestige already.
The other ones do have prestige, and what's happening with eLife is sort of interesting because their rejection rate is almost as high as Nature's and Science's, which means they're turning a lot into sort of an open version, open access version of these prestige journals, of what people refer to as the glamour journals, Cell, Nature, and Science. So it's an interesting thing. I mean, to me, if I were to blue sky this, I would just get rid of journals altogether, which would basically end Retraction Watch, because nobody would retract anything if they weren't publishing in journals. But I've got some other things to do, and my wife and I have some plans. We'd like to, do some things together. But that would require, again, a lot of the changes we've talked about here. But if the research record, if papers were not considered the sort of be-all and end-all, and therefore if people weren't so reluctant to correct them or to, addend them, that's not really a verb, and sort of, or retract them if need be, we'd be in better shape. And so that's an argument not necessarily for sort of buying the journals and turning them into what you want, unless you're sort of buying them the way a corporation buys something to put it out of business.
Right, that's another. Hadn't thought of that variation.
Right. I like the idea of buying all the journals, if that were feasible. We're trying the opposite, which is create a free public goods infrastructure so that anybody can start a journal, and then make it super easy to, because this is one of the big challenges, right? Scientific societies and everybody else are dependent on publishers because they provide an infrastructure that is hard for others to use and they don't have access to, and it's not open and everything else. So if that were instead a public good, right, the scholarly communication can happen through a free open infrastructure, then that process can evolve how the scientific community wants it to evolve. Just like Ivan said, maybe it turns out journals aren't needed in the formal sense, right? Instead, maybe it's I post a manuscript as soon as I'm done with it, and it's published. And the evaluation process, that is the key part of journals, is done post facto, and then the article itself iterates, right? I get some feedback from the community. I say, oh, I could improve that.
Right.
And I fix the article. Now it's version 2. Now it's version 3. And it evolves over time.
We wouldn't have the problem of previously retracted articles still being cited, because you would just, it's like when I tweet and I want to correct a mistake in my tweet, I can't. I have to post a new tweet, but no one's going to see that. If I could just edit the tweet, then people would share that. We have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure that we talk about the thing I alluded to at the beginning of the panel, which is, before the long run, how do we evaluate research, that we're going to act on, that we're going to use to decide what to spend our money and time on to help the world? I have the spectrum in my head of research quality, where on the one end is, well, I guess it's anecdote or, fantasy, but actually on the spectrum, one end is a single study with no control group, underpowered, et cetera, small sample size. And then at the other end would be maybe multiple meta-analyses, all including high-quality randomized controlled trials that all point in the same direction, showing the same effect. Somewhere, this is a spectrum of like how much evidence there is for an effect. Where on that spectrum where's your threshold where you would be comfortable acting on, spending time and money on the assumption that a result is real? Or you could dispute my spectrum, maybe that's the wrong spectrum.
Well, I think there's been an interesting case recently, and I think I'm not going to quite address your question, but just to throw another but just to throw another factor in there, there's been an interesting discussion about deworming, as we referenced earlier. One of the most influential RCTs in development economics was on a long-run study of deworming in Kenya, of mass deworming of school-aged children, and looking at the long-run effects on both school attendance and income. Not to get into that too much and go into the replication debate, but GiveWell wrote a post recently saying, okay, 2 out of their, I think it's 4 top recommended charities now do deworming, SCI and Deworm the World. And there's a question, should there be a second 10-year-long RCT of the effects of deworming? And GiveWell said, well, we're comfortable recommending these charities even without a replication in this sense, because it's very low cost. Deworming tablets are very low cost. We know that medically they get rid of worms, and we think that most likely there are benefits. And if we were to do an expensive, long-term study again, maybe by the time it completed, we would have really reduced the prevalence of worms to the point that mass deworming is no longer necessary. So we're going to go ahead and recommend those charities, recommend them to donors, even in the absence of this second long-term RCT. So I think all of this is to say, maybe that your question of where is the cutoff, where this evidence is enough, doesn't just involve the type of study, but it also includes considerations of cost effectiveness of the intervention, circumstances that you're in, and so on.
Well, and it also, which I think gets to this point Stephanie was making so well also, is it depends on what are the alternatives, right? And so in clinical medicine, you basically have to make these choices pretty much every day, probably many, many times a day. Do you wait and not do anything? Do you give the most aggressive treatment? Do you do something in the middle? And again, you can only compare 2 or 3 things in a trial, et cetera. We know what the methodology problems are. There's sort of a great case of this. It's sort of amusing and yet telling at the same time. The BMJ, British Medical Journal, publishes what's known as a Christmas issue every Christmas. And these are studies that they're actually real, but they're about really sort of wacky things. The data are real. I don't think anyone's tried to reproduce them, because you'll see in a second why you would never try to do that. But so in 2003, they published one that was of parachutes, right? And so what someone did was they went through PubMed, the sort of database of literature, scientific literature, and looked for, they said, we want to do a meta-analysis, a sort of study of studies of whether or not parachutes are effective when you're jumping out of a plane. As you probably can guess, there weren't any randomized, they found 0 randomized controlled clinical trials, because if you tried to send that through your institutional review board, that would obviously not work, although this guy, I guess, just jumped out of a plane without a parachute. So now we have a case report that we should probably publish. Hey, I can't even think, that's one of those things I can't get my head around, but that's just me. So, I mean, obviously, that does not mean we should all get up in planes and jump out of them without parachutes. I mean, the alternative is, except for this one person so far, certainly.
I like to imagine that he read that article in the Christmas issue and was like, well, there's no evidence, so.
But that's the point, is that what is the alternative? And so I think that's a really important part of the calculus when you're doing real life work.
Yeah, I mean, despite all of the critique of science that we're talking about here, it's still the best way of figuring out what's going on in the world, right? And so if the goal is knowledge, then science is the process that we want to use, or we need to use, to get the best picture that we can. And so what the threshold is almost doesn't make sense, because it's 2 different problems, right? Science, the accumulation of evidence, reduces uncertainty slowly over time. Policy needs to act today for problems that are existing today. And so use the best available evidence and make the decision that needs to be made. The improvement to make is representing uncertainty appropriately, right? Yeah, this is only a couple of different studies. There's we don't have, so show the wide uncertainty band. If you're going to make a policy decision, don't make one that locks you in for 15 years, because there really isn't enough evidence for that kind of investment yet. But don't do nothing, because you have problems you're trying to solve today. You do the best you can with what you've got.
So you could say science is the worst possible way of figuring out the world, except for all the others?
That might be a good way of describing it.
Steal a quote.
Yeah.
We have 30 seconds left. Does anyone have a closing thought that they didn't get an opportunity to share about either solutions to the replication crisis or reasons it's not as bad as we think, or heuristics to use to evaluate research?
Well, I think training is really important. We didn't really talk about that. So Center for Open Science and Berkeley Initiative for Transparency in the Social Sciences, and more recently Innovations for Poverty Action, have been doing training of young grad students and young professors in these questions. It's not always obvious where you should share data, what you should do to make it usable. There are new tools like Git, GitHub, MarkDoc, or Markdown that make reproducible research easier and better. And so I think training is really important. Funding training is important. It's something the community is working on.
Great. Well, that is time. Let's give our panelists a hand. This is a great conversation. Thank you, guys.